What happens when killers think they've gotten away with it? In 1974, an entire family disappeared, and for 43 years, their murderers lived freely, growing old with a secret they thought was buried forever. They believed they had committed the perfect crime, but they made one fatal mistake. It wasn't a slip-up at the scene, but an error born from pure arrogance. This is the story of how a mother, Barbara McCulkin, and her two young daughters, Vicki and Leanne, finally got justice. And it's the story of how their killers were brought down by the one thing they couldn't control: their own egos. January 16th, 1974. It was an ordinary night in the Brisbane suburb of Highgate Hill. Inside her home on Dorchester Street, 34-year-old Barbara McCulkin was waiting for her daughters to come home from a neighbor's party. When 13-year-old Vicki and 11-year-old Leanne returned, their mother wasn't alone. Two men were with her, associates of her estranged husband, Billy. A neighbor noticed a distinct orange Valiant Charger parked out front. And then, there was only silence. 2 days later, Billy McCulkin came to the house and walked into a deeply unsettling scene. The lights were on, the cats were locked inside starving, and a sewing project was left half-finished. Most chillingly of all, the beds hadn't been slept in. Barbara, Vicki, and Leanne were gone. The initial police investigation was catastrophically slow. In a time before modern forensics, the investigation went nowhere fast. The house on Dorchester Street, a potential goldmine of evidence, wasn't treated with the urgency a triple disappearance required, and the case quickly went cold. For Barbara's family, it was the start of a nightmare that would last more than 4 decades. As years stretched into decades, the McCulkin case became one of Queensland's most infamous cold cases. The two men last seen with Barbara were identified as Vincent O'Dempsey, who owned the Valiant Charger, and his associate, Garry "Shorty" Dubois, both known figures in Brisbane's criminal underworld. In 1980, it seemed like justice was finally coming when both men were charged with the abduction and murders. But the case was flimsy, built on too little evidence, and the charges were dropped. For O'Dempsey and Dubois, it must have felt like a total victory. They walked free, emboldened, believing they were untouchable while the bodies of their victims were never found. But the whispers never truly stopped. Why were they targeted? The motive, many believed, was tied to one of Australia's worst mass murders: the 1973 firebombing of the Whiskey Au Go Go nightclub, which killed 15 people. The theory was that Barbara McCulkin knew too much. Her estranged husband had criminal connections, and she had reportedly told others she was afraid because of what she'd overheard about the firebombing. In their world, Barbara had become a loose end, and loose ends were dealt with permanently. For 40 years, the case was frozen solid. The killers grew old. Vincent O'Dempsey, a feared underworld figure nicknamed the Angel of Death, and Garry Dubois settled into their lives. The perfect crime seemed to be holding up. Then, in 2014, a crack appeared in the wall of silence. A single tip to Crime Stoppers breathed new life into the cold case. It was the spark detectives needed. On the 40th anniversary of the disappearance, police launched a new public appeal for information. This time, the investigation would be relentless. The new information was horrifying. It was alleged that on that night in 1974, Barbara and her daughters were tied up, driven to the bush, and murdered. For the second time in their lives, Vincent O'Dempsey, now 76, and Garry Dubois, 67, were charged with the murders of the McCulkin family. Before we get to how it all came crashing down for them, If you appreciate stories where justice fights its way to the surface, no matter how long it takes, consider subscribing. We believe every victim's story deserves to be told. So what was different this time? What did prosecutors have in 2014 that they didn't have 4 decades earlier? They had the killer's own words. Believing they were invincible, both O'Dempsey and Dubois couldn't resist bragging about what they did. Their downfall came from confessing to people they mistakenly thought they could trust. A key witness, Warren MacDonald, told the court that while working with O'Dempsey in 1997, the Angel of Death boasted that he'd killed the McCulkins, but would never be caught for it. Then there was Carrie Scully, O'Dempsey's fiancée in 2011. He told her to buy a true crime book that had his picture in it. Lying in bed one night, he pointed to his photo and bragged about the murders, saying, "I'm good for it, but they'll never get me for it." Garry Dubois had been talking too. His friend Peter Hall testified that just days after the disappearance in 1974, Dubois confessed everything, giving a detailed account of how he and O'Dempsey had taken the family from their home. But the most damning confession came from O'Dempsey himself while he was in jail awaiting trial. He spoke to another prisoner, not knowing the man was secretly writing down their conversations on scraps of paper. O'Dempsey admitted Barbara had to be dealt with, but tried to shift blame for the worst of it, claiming, "I never laid a hand on the 2 kids, Shorty did." He also tried to get the informant to intimidate other witnesses to stop them from testifying. Because the confessions were only admissible against the man who made them, the judge ordered separate trials. In November 2016, a jury found Garry Dubois, then 69, guilty of the manslaughter of Barbara McCulkin and the rape and murder of her daughters, Vicki and Leanne. He stood without emotion as the verdict was read. 6 months later, in May 2017, it was Vincent O'Dempsey's turn. A jury found the 78-year-old guilty of all 3 murders. One of Queensland's longest and most painful cold cases was finally over. Both men were sentenced to life in prison, with the judge, Justice Peter Applegarth, telling them he expected them both to die in jail. Addressing O'Dempsey directly, he said, "You murdered a defenseless woman. You are a child killer. You are beyond redemption." Turning to Dubois, he described the horror of the girls' final moments. The girls must have known their mother had been killed. They must have known, as you did, that they were to be killed. Following the convictions, Queensland's Attorney General announced a new inquest into the Whiskey Au Go Go firebombing, believing other witnesses might finally feel safe enough to come forward. For 43 years, 2 men lived as free men, shielded by a code of silence and the failures of the initial investigation. They grew old, certain the ghosts of their past were gone for good. But they underestimated the power of their own monstrous pride. They couldn't resist talking about their perfect crime, and in doing so, handed justice the very weapon it needed to convict them. The bodies of Barbara, Vicki, and Leanne McCulkin have never been found. A final, cruel secret their killers took to their graves. But their guilt is no longer a secret. The silence that fell over Dorchester Street all those years ago has finally been broken, replaced by the fact that even after 4 decades, justice can still have the final word.